Chicago is already insolvent in most people's opinions, anybody that's looking at the numbers. And Chicagoans are already on the hook for massive amounts of debt. And so it's really hard to think about how Chicagoans can really afford either one of these outcomes, regardless of how the strike ends up and what terms are agreed to.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel.
Jeff Berkowitz here in Chicago.
And Jeff, we're going to be focusing this week on one of the biggest issues happening around the state, and that is the strike by the Chicago Teachers Union against the city of Chicago and the negotiations going on with the mayor, and trying to put some of this into context for what it means financially, both for the taxpayers in the city of Chicago as well as taxpayers around the state of Illinois.
It's a big ticket item. Very succinctly, we have about 25,000 teachers in the Chicago Teachers Union. They're currently making about $78,000 on average. That's the current level before the new contract. Under the proposed new 5-year contract, at the end of the contract, the average salary for those 25,000 teachers will be about $100,000. So if you take 25,000 and you multiply it by $78,000, you get 1.95 billion with a B dollars. If you take that 25,000 and you multiply it times the new average at the end of the 5-year contract, which is $100,000, you get $2.5 billion. You subtract 1.95 from 2.5 billion, you get $550 million. So I hope you followed all that.
That was a little, what is the $550 million?
The $550 million, that would be the additional tax money that the city of Chicago, or CPS, they're the same thing, has to get from the taxpayers, who would be primarily the residents of the city of Chicago who pay taxes, the individuals.
So $550 million more.
Collectively, right, $550 million more, and that's for a main thing. That's a 5-year contract, and we'll explain during the show. That's $200 million that you usually hear only $350. We'll explain during the show why $350 million is not the number. It's $550 million, and folks, it's even more because there are many things that are not in that $550 million. You know, the new nurses.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Jeff. Let's.
Okay.
I think we need to lay this out piece by piece. Recently, I interviewed Ted Dabrowski, that's a policy analyst with WirePoints. We did about a 12-minute interview on this very topic. We're going to use parts of that interview just right ahead. And WirePoints, if you don't know, is a website, wirepoints.com. You can go. They publish and focus on financial issues primarily. Let's take a listen to a recent part of that interview I did with Ted Dabrowski, where basically he's laying out that the city of Chicago can ill afford to spend any more money.
Chicago is the lowest downgraded city of any of the major cities in the country. CPS is also junk. It's already 5 notches into a junk rating. And that's below Detroit. So there is no room for more fiscal problems in the city. Number 2, if you look at home values, if you look at across the country, you look at the major cities, Chicago is in real terms, people's home values are deteriorating. So people's nest eggs are being hit. If you look at virtually every statistic, Chicago is shrinking. Of the major cities in the country, Chicago is the only one shrinking consistently. So, even if you wanted to pay teachers more, somebody's got to start respecting the fact that there is no room. People are leaving. They've had massive tax hikes under Rahm Emanuel. Home values are stuck. It's a really dangerous proposition to even put on higher salaries, which means more pensions. And lastly, if you look at the pension debt, the amount that each household is on the hook for, it is massive, massive. And there's no way that Chicagoans are going to stick around in the numbers that are needed.
So anything that makes it worse is going to, and Jeff, I guess the thing with Ted Dabrowski would say this strike is obviously going to make it worse.
Well, number one, we're taping this on October 20th, okay? That's a Sunday. We've already had 2 days of the strike. So if people have been watching and they haven't been paying attention, CTU has been on strike for 2 days. Okay, we've gone 2 days that the kids and we're not talking charter schools; they're separate. So there are 360,000 students in CPS, but 60,000 go to charter schools. Some of that's unionized, but that's a separate issue. They're not on strike at the moment. So we're talking about 300,000 CPS kids who have not been going to school for 2 days. The mayor has said, contrary to past strikes, we're not going to make up those 2 days. They're lost. Those kids have lost 2 days of education. She seems to say it's too disruptive. People have plans. They can't go further into the year in June, so forth. And the mayor said, when I just heard her speak on Friday or Saturday, although they're continuing to negotiate over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday, doesn't sound like she did not think this strike will be settled so the kids are returning on Monday. So that's 3 days lost. When will it be? 4 days lost, 5 days lost, okay? I mean, that's real education. And folks, this is real money. I mean, what Ted is saying is City of Chicago and CPS are both in trouble before the increases from the new contract. I mean, Chicago is in junk status. They're 2 steps ahead of Detroit, which is really in junk status, meaning they're bond credit.
Detroit already went bankrupt.
They already went bankrupt, and Detroit is two steps better than CPS. CPS, look, not talking about the teachers. We're talking about the credit rating of CPS. They are the bottom of the barrel. What are we good at? We're good at paying high. We're good at the city of Chicago and CPS and paying high salaries. We're highest, if you compare us to the relevant inner cities across the country, Chicago's higher than New York. Chicago's higher than LA.
Well, let me interject here for a minute, because it's so easy. It's the trouble with trying to talk about dollar amounts, which this is about on television is a thin medium. But what we're trying to do at this point in the show is just basically put into context, where is CPS, where is Chicago before any settlement? And as one of our graphic asks, can taxpayers afford a CPS settlement? Jeff, we have the city of Chicago. Their overall budget is what?
The overall budget for the city of Chicago is about $10 billion. And the mayor told us, I guess, a month ago, that we were in a hole for $838 million. She doesn't have the revenue.
So that's right now, before anything else. They don't have $838 million to pay the bills that they need, right?
Right. When she came in, she said the city was $1 billion in the hole. She found savings so she could cut it down from $1 billion to $838 million. It's anticipated she will tell us later this week, in a few days, what the status is of the budget, what she's proposing, how she's going to resolve that hole, etc. But the short point is, Terry, she was hoping for a 5-year contract. This is designed about a 5-year contract. Her proposal is for 5 years, has not been agreed to yet, okay? All the numbers we've been talking about, the $550 million increase I threw out, that's based on a 5-year contract. You know, there's a lot of power going on here, which we may get into, or a lot of power discussion, politics discussion. The mayor's on a 4-year cycle. She will run again for roughly a little less than 4 years from now. This is her 150th day. We can call it accountability 150, how she's doing. But the point is, she would love to have a 5-year contract, so when she's running for re-election, she doesn't have to deal with the new costs in 2023 of CTU. You see the point? What if the CTU says to her tomorrow in the negotiations, we changed our minds?
Look, here's what I would say is, we have a $10 billion budget. She already has an $838 million hole. When she gave her budget address, she also cautioned those listening that there is baked in the pie, and she wasn't talking about any more money going to CPS at that time. She was saying already baked in the pie are some millions of dollars of additional costs the city is going to be facing. Let's listen to her comments from that time.
While we are working towards balancing this year's revenue with this year's cost, 2 years from now, in 2021, we will have to figure out how to pay for the increased annual cost of over $200 million for public safety services, followed by another increase of $400 million for municipal and labor pensions the year after that. In other words, no matter what we do for this coming budget, Chicago will be on the hook for over $500 million in new pension obligations over the next 3 years.
Well, Terry, let's clarify one thing. Because when I said, you asked me what the budget was, that was $10 billion for the city of Chicago budget. But folks, we're talking about CTU and CPS. That's a separate budget. The CPS budget is not within that $10 billion. No, folks. That's a $7.7 billion budget, an operating cost of at least $6 billion. That's all separate from the $10 billion budget, okay? If you wanted to know, and really, the people in Chicago who are paying taxes for CPS, they're also paying for the city of Chicago, the same people. So what's the total budget for the city of Chicago and CPS? Almost $18 billion. And we've been talking about the hole in the city of Chicago budget of $838 million. You just saw a clip of the mayor talking about $500 or $600 million of additional pension payments we're going to have to make in the city of Chicago. Well, that's not CPS. So let's keep this straight during the show. There's the city of Chicago $10 billion budget. There's the CPS $7.7 billion budget. It's all coming, folks. If you're a corporate taxpayer, if you're an individual taxpayer, it's coming out of your wallet.
And well, one way or another, and as Ted Dabrowski pointed out, the other thing is we just had, I believe, a property tax increase under Rahm Emanuel, and obviously increasing the taxes would be one of the ways the mayor would have to come up with the dollars to make good on any kind of a proposal that's going to add hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to current spending. Let's take a look at a graphic that, again, was produced by WirePoints, but the source is the U.S. Census Bureau and the Illinois State Board of Education on teacher salary, and it compares the average taxpayer's income in Chicago to the teacher's salaries. And we see here that if you look at on the blue on the left-hand side, it says the median Chicago household income in Chicago by taxpayers $55,295. If you look at the teacher's salary on the first red bar on the left there, it says teacher's starting salary with a bachelor's degree, which I presume every one of them would have a bachelor's degree, would be $56,665. So the average teacher salary is higher than the household income of what the Chicago taxpayer is making. And Jeff?
Right, and that's important emphasis is that you said household. So that $55,000 number for Chicago average or median, that's household. You could have multiple earners there. We're only talking, when we look at the other part of this graph, teacher salaries. We're not taking household. You could have one teacher who had a bachelor's degree who was starting at the salary of $56,000, okay? And that's a starting salary, and that's one teacher. What if you had two teachers, a husband and wife, and they were starting? We'd be talking $112,000 or $114,000 of household income. And now the household people paying the taxes have almost half as much as that household. That's just an anecdotal, hypothetical. But the more important point, if you look at that graph further, you see the average salary for CPS in 2019 is $78,000, average, okay? And then if you look at the far right, that bar graph, you see 97,757, or roughly 98,000. That's what the average is going to grow to under the proposed 5-year contract in 2024. The point is, we're talking big numbers here. And can Chicago afford that? That's the proposal. It hasn't been agreed to by CTU. They want more. What do they want? Well, they're not pushing so much on having higher salaries than it's offered. They want a guarantee in writing as a part of the contract that there'll be many more nurses hired, many more librarians.
Additional
Many more
staff, so
social
we might
workers.
say support staff.
Right.
Let me, we don't have, to be fair to the teachers here, and we want to be fair to the teachers. This, just to be clear, Jeff and I are not anti-teacher or anti-teacher salary. It's a question of putting into some context, how much would a settlement cost relative to what dollars are out there? What is the current financial position of the city of Chicago and their ability to pay more? And what impact would that have on taxpayers? Whether it's Chicago taxpayers or downstate taxpayers that would be asked to bail out the city through paying more for, downstaters paying more. We, Jeff, have a video here produced by the Chicago Teachers Union where this runs about 1 minute and 20 seconds. The audio, I apologize, is not great, but we didn't produce it. But we wanted to have the CTU kind of respond as they did in this video, where a teacher says some of that $97,000 figure that's being bandied about, they say is not accurate. Let's take a listen to this. Again, folks, apologize for the audio, but it is, if you listen hard, you can make it out.
Hi, I'm Jim Caballero. I'm a special education and math teacher at Chicago Academy High School, and I'm here today to clarify CPS's salary offer to CTU members. CPS is basing their 16% raise on an average teacher. Right now, we're finding that average teacher to be lane 1 and in their 11th year, step 11. That teacher is currently making $78,961. In 5 years, that teacher will be making $97,757 in their 16th year of teaching. This is what CPS is putting out to the media and the public currently. What they're neglecting to say, though, is that the average teacher will not be making that in 2024. The average teacher at that time is still going to be an 11th year teacher due to attrition, teacher turnover, retirement, and the fact that there's always going to be newer teachers in our system. That teacher is currently in their 6th year of teaching, making $60,819. In 5 years, that teacher will be in their 11th year and will be making $84,460.
So there you go, Jeff. We have the teachers saying it's not $97,000, it's going to be more like $84,460.
Well, we have a disagreement here. Average is an average. Statistics has a definition for the average. You can say it's the median, you can say it's the average. They're different things. So the audio was bad. I'm not sure where that teacher was going, but I contend those numbers are correct. We're going from an average of about 78,000 under the new proposed contract to an average of about 98,000, close enough to 100,000 to call it that. But the more important point here, before we go to the next graphic, is that the dispute here, folks, so far, and again, well, number one, the mayor has complained 2 months ago saying, we should have a deal here. She came out and said, look, the CTU wanted 16% over 5 years. CTU wanted 16%. CPS was offering 14%. They raised it to 16%. They met that without going into extended discussion. When you discuss the 5-year cost, and when you discuss the fact that teachers are moving up in seniority, up across lanes, the 16%, the Chicago Tribune says, don't have to take my word for it, is not accurate. The cost of this contract in terms of increased teacher salaries, putting pensions aside, for 5 years is 25%. But more importantly, the CPS says, you want more teachers, you want more social workers, you want more nurses, we'll give you more 200 of each, 200 new of each, okay? You want more librarians, we'll give you more of that.
Well, let's go to the cost of that.
But before we go to that, the big dispute here is CTU says, we don't want your representation, we don't want a side agreement, we want it in that contract. We want you
CTU wants
be
to
locked
put,
in.
they don't want just a verbal agreement by the mayor. The mayor's already said, we agree with you, you ought to have more teachers, you ought to have more librarians. CTU says, no, you got to write the number in, that each school is going to have so much. The mayor doesn't want to have her
contract.
in the contract, in writing. The mayor doesn't want to have her hands tied to have that written down, which has never, to my knowledge, been done at all. It's always been the mayor has to have the ability to manage the city. She would argue, I think, that she's saying, you know, if you put that in writing, you're tying my hands and then I don't have the ability to manage the budget anymore.
Yeah, let's talk about, let's go to that graphic and see a little bit more of what we're talking about here.
Okay, so you see
There
there
it
the
is.
cost differential. We see the allegation, the estimation that it would go from 2019, average Chicago public school teacher making $78,009 would go to $97,700 over 5 years. But Jeff, you can see the additional numbers there on the graphic.
Right, and this is coming from wirepoints.com. The average second-year teacher currently under this current contract is about $53,000. That would go to $72,000 in the new contract in 2024. That's a second-year teacher coming out of college with a 4-year degree and a teaching credential starting at $72,000. What about the nurses? The average school nurse? Well, they're making now $49,000 under the current contract. What will it go up? 48% to $72,000. Okay. What about the average teacher assistant? $32,000. They're going to go to $43,000. What is that? 37%. So we're talking across the board, big ticket item increases. And again, we come down to, can the city afford it? Because we're only talking here the CPS CTU contract. What about that $10 billion contract, but $10 billion Chicago budget that has its own pension problem, its own issues, its own holes, okay? And, you know, the mayor needs some flexibility because things may happen.
Well, as she said, and we already showed, she's going to have to,
Yeah.
she has $838 million hole in the current budget. As she said, over the next 3 years, nothing to do with CPS spending more. She's going to have another $600 million, which would mean even if there's not $1 more in CPS that she has to come up with, she's going to be facing a $1.4 billion hole in the Chicago budget over the next 3 years. That's the context that we need to understand about these negotiations.
Well, the more important question here is who's in charge? You know, we have people in the city of Chicago that elected Mayor Lori Lightfoot as mayor. It was in the runoff, it was an overwhelming mandate. You know, something like 75% for Lori Lightfoot, 25% or so for Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Wasn't close. The people in Chicago said Lori's their person. They trusted her. They wanted her to be making these decisions. CTU is saying, we're going to make those decisions. And we're aligning ourselves with a group of people who are much broader than teachers. We're talking now about affordable housing. We want that on the table. We want to see what you're going to guarantee us about that, okay? We want to see these people, they're meant, whatever maybe they say 20%, 15% of the kids are homeless. What are we going to do to take care of that, okay? And we want to have a say, we, the Chicago Teachers Union. So folks, we have a fundamental issue here. Who decides? The city of Chicago mayor or Jesse Sharkey, who's the president of the Chicago Teachers Union? Okay, or
So your
else.
point you're making is who runs the city?
Who runs the city? The CTU or Mayor Lightfoot in conjunction with the city council?
Again, the whole show here, I
that's-
think, Jeff, we're, on one hand, what the bigger point we're trying to do is just frame the issue. Too often we don't get these kind of background numbers. I want to run a clip from Charlie Evans. And Jeff, tell us who Charlie Evans is.
He is the president of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. There are 12 branches of the Federal Reserve across the country. Chicago is one of those 12 branches. Charlie Evans is the president. He's involved. He is on the Open Market Committee, which sets monetary policy for the entire country.
So he knows how
He's
the
an
budget is
important guy.
going, and basically, let's listen to this as a relatively short clip, but Charlie Evans was recently interviewed on CNBC, and he's talking about how healthy the economy is.
I think that, with inflation being a little bit on the light side, there's there's the capacity to adjust policy if that's necessary, but the fundamentals for the economy continue to be solid. The consumer is solid.
So he says the consumer is solid, and the point I would make, Charlie Evans is basically saying right now we have a very good economy. And folks, here's the other thing to put in, why we played that clip. If the mayor of Chicago is saying that we're already falling behind by $1.4 billion in the budget, irrespective of any more spending on CPS, and Charlie Evans is saying we have a good economy, if we're falling behind when the economy is good, how much longer is the economy going to be good? And if we're then going to add on top of the taxpayers billions of dollars more on top of the $1.4 billion hole Chicago's already digging itself into, at what point do you get caught up, if you're not getting caught up, when times are good?
You're right. We haven't had a recession for 10 years. That's a pretty long time, maybe 11 years. If we have a recession that hits the entire nation and hits the city of Chicago, and our revenue goes down even more, our tax revenue and so forth, we're in even worse shape than we are now. CTU would like to lock the city of Chicago into these guarantees of more than 200 new social workers, more than 200 new nurses, more than an X number of teaching assistants. They're locked in. Is that any way to run a city? Because if they're locked in and those expenses go even higher, what do? They can't issue money. They can't print money. They're not like the federal government, which also is constrained as to printing money. So seriously, and just to frame this issue very succinctly, the polling currently shows that the residents of the city of Chicago support the teacher strike to the tune of 40%. 38% oppose that. I think the mayor has to go on the public offensive, has to almost be taking out ads. She's got to rally. The media seem to be on her side if they're going to take, they're objective, they're fair, but they seem to be making some of the same points we're making here, Terry. But at least the residents don't seem to have gotten the message that you and I are talking about.
Let me jump in and say, Jeff, there's one resident that is leaving the city, and he's a famous resident, Dennis Byrne, who's been a columnist. As we tape this on October 20th, Sunday, Mr. Byrne announced in a very long kind of op-ed in the Chicago Tribune, he's leaving the city, that public employee unions have turned the idea of public service into a joke on the taxpayers, who in fact have become the public servants. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in this long editorial, which you can read, Mr. Byrne says, like many others, that he is now going to be leaving the city of Chicago. We've hopefully framed some of the challenges that faces the city. We have just a little bit of time if you want to wrap this up.
Yeah, we got like 2 minutes. 2 minutes, folks. We have an important veto session coming up in the Illinois legislature. We're taping this on October 20th. That veto session starts in a week on October 28th. The mayor has said, look, her proposal for Chicago Casino has some problems. She'd like to amend that legislation in the veto session, or just have the legislators amend it. She's now proposed a publicly owned casino that would take the money and say 51% of the revenue from the casino goes to the state, 49% goes to Chicago. That would give her, or the city of Chicago, $370 million.
Jeff, I'm going to have to cut you off. We're going a little long here. So, but we thanks everyone for watching.